Hello learners and welcome to the 13th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. So far in this course, we have had a general introduction to the poetics as well as the background to the 20th century. In addition to that, we have also taken an in-depth look at the work and life of two poets, that's William Butler Yeats and Thomas Hardy. In this lecture, we will continue that journey into the poetry and the poetics of the 20th century by looking at the work of the poet Hilda Doolittle, or as she was known, H.D. Who was Hilda Doolittle, and why should we study her work? I'll begin with a brief biographical background in which we'll focus on her work as well as her dialogue with a very important intellectual tradition, that of psychoanalysis. After that, we will go into one poem, very iconic poem by H.D., which will connect this discussion with the discussion of the elegy, as well as introduce some important feminist aspects of writing and understanding poetry. H.D. or Hilda Doolittle was born on September the 10th, 1886, in a place named Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in the US, and was raised in the Moravian community. She attended the Bryn Mawr College in Philadelphia, and it was while at college that she formed lasting friendships with other poets. Two of these poets would become very famous and are studied today as among the most influential poets of the 20th century, that is Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams. Doolittle did not complete her degree, but these connections would continue to shape and inform her career. Like many of her generation, Doolittle moved to London. As we've seen, this move eastward was influential and quite formative in the careers of several American poets. Like many American poets of her generation, H.D. moved to London and immersed herself in the city's literary and artistic milieu. Like many others, Doolittle was also a pioneer, and the pioneering movement or the pioneering act of H.D. was that she became one of the founding members of the Imagist movement. As I have discussed earlier, Ezra Pound was among the other pioneers of this movement and defined Imagism through the theory and practice of writing new kinds of poems. Incidentally, H.D. was briefly engaged to Ezra Pound as well. That marriage did not take place, but their friendship and literary partnership continued to have a reciprocal shaping influence on the careers of both these poets. And in fact, it was Ezra Pound who gave the moniker H.D. Imagist to Hilda Doolittle. During this period, H.D. published some of her early work, and some of the titles of this work are important. The first book of poems that H.D. published was titled Sea Garden. This epitomized Imagist principles through very powerful images. They were very vivid and crystalline images of the natural world. The year after this, H.D. published a book of poems titled The God. And this book of poems is important because it reflects her fascination with Greek mythology and ancient spirituality. A few years after this, H.D. published a book of poems titled Hymen. This was a collection that explored themes of marriage, gender, and identity, and continued her engagement with mythological subjects. Each of these themes, powerful images, a curiosity about the power of Greek mythology, and an obsession or a preoccupation with gender dynamics, the unequal relations between men and women. All of these three concerns would come together in the poem that we will discuss a little bit later, which is Eurydice. In the second part, roughly speaking, of her career, we see that H.D. began to engage very powerfully and with great sensitivity with the intellectual tradition of psychoanalysis. This was a time that produced a great deal of personal struggle, and I'm roughly characterizing this second part of H.D.'s life and career as spanning the years 1921 to 1933. This was a time of great personal struggle. HD endured significant personal upheaval, including a quite traumatic stillbirth, the collapse of her marriage to the poet Richard Aldington, and the death of her brother in World War I. As a result of these experiences, perhaps, HD began to undertake therapy with Sigmund Freud. And the period of this psychoanalytical therapy spanned the years 1933 to 1934. HD visited Sigmund Freud at his clinic in Vienna, and this experience profoundly influenced HD's later work. She was able to integrate psychoanalytic concepts into her mythic as well as autobiographical writing. Just to get a brief sense of how this connection was developed, both HD and Freud agreed that the unconscious of the human psyche was structured a little bit like a surrealist poem. So both Sigmund Freud and HD were influenced by the formal as well as intellectual aspects of the other's discipline, which is to say, Sigmund Freud was influenced by poetic and creative writing in developing his ideas of the unconscious. Similarly, HD was influenced by psychoanalysis in developing new ways of writing. In fact, one can argue that Eurydice, the poem which we will study, is a deeply psychoanalytic reading of the elegy. In fact, the whole tradition, the Western literary tradition of elegiac writing, is reinterpreted from a feminist psychoanalytic perspective. One can say this about Eurydice. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. Let us take these concepts one by one, and we will eventually arrive at an understanding of Eurydice. Some major publications from this period, that is Heliodora and Other Poems from the year 1924. This volume reflects a more expansive and introspective voice, blending classical imagery with personal reflection. A couple of years later, HD published Palimpsest, which was a modernist novel employing a fragmented, experimental narrative to explore identity and trauma. In the third stage of her life and career, war, spirituality, and a visionary poetics become very important for HD. This was the time when World War II unfolded, and like everyone else, HD also experienced it as a profoundly shocking and moving experience. HD turned to mysticism, spirituality, and occult traditions as a way to process the war's devastation and personal turmoil. She also undertook some mythic revisioning. She began to reimagine foundational Western myths through a feminist lens and began to challenge patriarchal authority and to assert the centrality of something that she called the feminine divine. This was a period when HD published one of her most curious and interesting works of nonfiction, which is a tribute to Freud, published in the year 1944. This is a hybrid work that blends aspects of the memoir and psychoanalytic theory, and reflects on the sessions that HD had with Sigmund Freud, and is almost an unprecedented and unique intellectual document. It is a record of their therapeutic sessions, but it is also a contribution to psychoanalytic theory and an important document in the history of 20th century thought. Now, it's important to think a little bit about HD's engagement with Sigmund Freud and how it had both personal as well as intellectual ramifications. Now, the first thing to note is that it unfolded during a crucial time in her life when she sought psychoanalysis as a coping mechanism to deal with emotional distress, war, trauma, and identity conflicts. These engagements, which took place in the early 1930s in Vienna, as I've mentioned before, profoundly influenced her poetry, prose, and her mythic imagination, while also revealing a complex power dynamic between a pioneering female poet and a male doctor, a very influential figure. In fact, so influential as to have been referred to even today as the father of modern psychoanalysis. Now, the context is important first. H.D. began psychoanalysis with Freud in the year 1933-34. This was when she was in her late 40s. She sought treatment for severe anxiety and emotional turmoil. And the ostensible or the somewhat obvious or factual causes that we may presume for these may be the trauma of World War I, that is, the devastation of war and the death of close friends and family members, which was bound to have a deep impact on anyone, and especially so for a sensitive poet as H.D. was. There are also personal losses. That is, she had lost her own brother, and her relationships with two very important male figures in her life were also going through a lot of stress. She had grown distant from her friend and former fiancé, Ezra Pound, and was going through the breakup of her marriage with her husband, Richard Aldington. These were some of the causes for the deep distress that may have driven H.D. to seek psychoanalysis with Freud. And it's also important to remember that at that time, Freud did not have the kind of influence or validation and respect that Freud has today. And so it was something of a risk and a very strange choice. It was not a natural choice for H.D. to seek out psychoanalysis. Nonetheless, she did. She was also going through a crisis in her identity. Sexual orientation, which, like many in the 20th century, had assumed to be naturally heterosexual, H.D. had begun to question the heterosexuality that she had assumed without thinking. She had begun to identify as bisexual, maintaining relationships with both men and women. And this was bound to produce conflicts and bound to produce a lack of validation given the repressive and heteronormative conditions of the time in which she lived. H.D. was also experiencing a creative crisis. As if these personal challenges were not enough, there were also professional and creative challenges. H.D. was experiencing writer's block and sought insight into her creative process. As for Freud, Freud was in the final years of his career, and H.D. was one of his last patients. Their sessions were marked by powerful intellectual exchange, as H.D. challenged Freud's male-centric theories. On the other hand, Freud viewed her as a fascinating case because of her creative imagination and visionary experiences. Now, during the analysis, Freud focused on interpreting H.D.'s dreams, memoirs, and mythic imagination, which aligned with his theories on the unconscious, symbolism, and sexuality. The discussion of these sessions, which H.D. has recorded in her book Tribute to Freud, comprised some of these areas. The relationship between mothers and daughters. Freud was curious about how H.D.'s relationship with her mother shaped her self and her psyche. Bisexuality and androgyny were discussed. Freud recognized H.D.'s bisexual identity but framed it within his Oedipal model, which H.D. found quite limiting, as one naturally would. Nonetheless, in the 20s and the 30s, it was not very easy to challenge a professional doctor. It was assumed that doctors like Freud and physicians had a great deal of authority. They had the power to believe and to shape the belief of others as well, given the kind of respect that the medical profession had. Nonetheless, Freud's status as a doctor and a qualified physician did not deter H.D. from challenging this very limited understanding of her sexuality, that is, the Oedipal understanding of her sexuality. H.D.'s poetry, in contrast, emphasized a fluid and empowered sense of gender. The two, that is, Freud and H.D., also discussed myth and the unconscious a great deal. H.D. brought mythic and archetypal figures, figures from Greek myth like Eurydice as well as Helen of Troy, into their discussions, anticipating Carl Jung's ideas about the archetypes and collective memory. The two, that is Freud and H.D., also discussed artistic psychology a great deal. Freud acknowledged the special insight and psychic depth of all artists, and he viewed H.D. as exceptional in her ability to symbolize and transform trauma into art. As I mentioned, these discussions form the basis of H.D.'s book Tribute to Freud, which presents a personal reflection on the therapeutic and intellectual dimensions of this interaction. H.D. disagreed with Freud very strongly, and it's important to take a moment to understand the nature of that disagreement and its critique. While H.D. respected Freud, she also subtly critiqued his patriarchal framework. She found Freud's focus on phallic and Oedipal models highly restrictive and worked to reclaim feminine power and myth in her poetry. For H.D., the unconscious was not merely a site of repressed desire, but a sacred space of female creativity and spiritual insight. Now, it's important to think for a moment why this disagreement makes sense. For H.D., the Freudian unconscious was shaped by an underlying idea of repression. To explain this in very simple terms, Freud argues that human beings have desires which society cannot allow. And the primary or the chief example of a desire that all human beings have but which society cannot allow is the Oedipal complex. That is, the desire of a male child to kill his father and marry his mother. And Freud very famously uses the example of Oedipus Tyrannus or Oedipus Rex, examples from Greek literature, classical Greek drama, to describe this psychological condition. Now, from a feminist psychoanalytic perspective, H.D. found the use of Greek myth very interesting, very enabling, very fruitful. But H.D. found something very problematic about designing or identifying the unconscious merely through the idea of repression. So, in Freud's view, because there are a lot of desires which cannot be fulfilled, right? These desires are shunted away from one's rational or thinking or conscious mind and are stored in a place called the unconscious, which is a part of the same body, but it contains desires which are no longer expressed and which take on other forms. According to H.D., the idea that the unconscious contains only repressed desires comes from a masculine perspective. We will see this critique of masculine perspectives taken to a very high level in the poem Eurydice. In the book Tribute to Freud, H.D. acknowledges Freud's intellectual brilliance but pushes back against his gendered assumptions, especially regarding female sexuality and creativity. She framed psychoanalysis as mutual dialogue, where her visionary imagination and mythic language opened pathways beyond Freud's rational view. At this point, we can take a moment and read this poem and get a sense of what exactly is going on and how we can take different perspectives to try and understand this poem. This is Eurydice, and just a quick note about where this poem first appeared. It appeared in the collection Heliodora and Other Poems, which was published in the year 1924. This is broadly considered to be a collection in which H.D. has established herself and is very comfortable with her position as an authoritative feminist poet. This collection is known for the lack of anxiety or the lack of insecurity that H.D. experiences as a poet. She has published 3 collections of poetry before, is an important public figure, has held the editorships of multiple journals and magazines. So HD is no longer anxious to demonstrate to her readers that she is a good poet. She is a good poet and she knows it. And she uses this opportunity to simply write the best possible poems. That is one thing to note about this particular moment in HD's poetic career. Another thing to note is that this is a collection in which HD has established her interest in two very important sets of ideas. The first is classical Greek myth, and the second is unequal gender relations or feminism. So, in the collection, the god and hymen, respectively, HD has established that gender is important to her and Greek myths are important to her. When the collection Heliodora and Other Poems appears, the intention has already been established. The only thing left to do is to actually fulfill and realize those desires. And we can see the realization of this desire and the fulfillment of these ideas in the poem Eurydice. Before I go into explaining the myths and the gender dynamics of this poem, I would simply like to read the poem and to recognize the powerful voice that comes through, the voice with which HD speaks. The voice is the most powerful aspect of this poem, and it's important to understand something about the voice, what it's telling us, what is the texture and tone of this voice, how we should best listen to this voice, and what is the voice telling us. Once we have answered these questions, we can reflect on how this poem combines a particular Greek myth with a particular understanding of gender relations. So, I will now read Eurydice. Eurydice by H.D. So you have swept me back, I who could have walked with the live souls above the earth, I who could have slept among the live flowers at last. So for your arrogance and your ruthlessness, I am swept back, where dead lichens drip, dead cinders upon moss of ash. So for your arrogance, I am broken at last, I who had lived unconscious, who was almost forgot. So, just reflecting for a moment on these first three stanzas, right? The tone is that of a person who is blaming someone else. Right? There's a great deal of dissatisfaction and anger. The title of the poem gives us a hint as to who might be speaking these lines. Eurydice, that's the title. So we can easily assume that Eurydice is the person who is speaking these lines. Now, if we assume that Eurydice is the speaker of these words, then it makes sense that the other person in this conversation, or the silent partner in this conversation, or the person whose ghostly presence is invoked simply as an excuse or an occasion to actually write this poem and not actually take feedback or not actually hear from them, is Orpheus. Why do I say that? I say that because Orpheus and Eurydice is a famous myth, is a very famous story in Greek mythology. The assumption that Eurydice is speaking and Orpheus is listening situates this conversation in a very particular moment in their relationship. Right? What has happened? So you have swept me back, I who could have walked with the live souls above the earth, I who could have slept among the live flowers at last. Right? So it means that Orpheus has done something which has deprived Eurydice of the opportunity of doing something which she now realizes would have been valuable, good, enjoyable, something that she desires. So what has Orpheus deprived Eurydice of? If one remembers the myth, one can get a clue to this answer, to this puzzle. I will not describe exactly what the myth says. I'll say that it is enough for us to note at this point that the assumption that these words lead us to make requires an understanding of the myth which is different from popular versions of the myth. Right? There are multiple versions of the myth. There are multiple versions of the narrative of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. And in these opening lines, we get a sense that HD is taking a very unique interpretation. Not only unique, HD is adhering to a minority understanding of this famous narrative. The dominant understanding of the narrative is different from the understanding that Eurydice, the poem, is working with. I will talk more about these myths, the feminist appropriation of this myth, and the poem Eurydice in the next lecture. Thank you.